Welcome back, Praggies, for another episode of Pragmatic Optimists. Remember to like, subscribe, and share to Legal AF on the Midas Touch platform. We are so excited to bring you a dose of optimism. Rachel and I will not be joined by a guest today, but we are super excited just to gab, which I think is both of our professional wheelhouses as young gabbers who are often on the internet. We're going to circle back to a few more conversations and a few more threads we'd like to pull with the immigration topic we had. It is absolutely crazy bananas. Anyone who is not paying attention should really be concerned about what this could potentially forecast for American surveillance. When I have been reading what is going on in DHS and in the IRS, and also how our tax dollars are being used as citizens, I think it should raise not only the little alarm flags in our head, but it should also call us all to action and to thinking a little bit more deeply about how we hold our government accountable to, one, how they use our tax dollars, but also how they collect information about us, including our most sensitive information, like our saliva and blood samples, which currently, and we'll dig into a little bit more, is potentially going to be held indefinitely by people who are detained in ICE facilities. So, Rachel, I know that we have a lot to gab about. Anything before we get started that you wanted to get off your chest or share some another dose of optimism?
I should have had more time to prepare for that one. I was thinking about how I needed to get my optimism together at the end. I think on a personal level, I am feeling really gratified by the way that a variety of people that you and I have known kind of through our personal and professional lives coming onto the show, sharing their expertise with people, the interactions that we're getting, the degree to which my mother loves every single time you say Praggies, I get a text. So thanks, Julie and Tiara, on that one. I think on a federal level, the optimism that I'm feeling is that we are seeing, I think, really effective messaging from federal level elected Democrats for the first time in a while, in my opinion. And I think one of the things that makes that tough is that what we've been reluctant to learn on the left is that the salacious kind of look at the Epstein files, look at this corruption, that aspect plays. And it's not only distasteful, but I do think that we need to be considerate about how we play those things when there are real people that have had their entire lives kind of defined by the harms done to them by people like Jeffrey Epstein. And so I think that one of the reasons why people have been reluctant to really hammer on these things is because those can be difficult messaging waters to navigate. But I'm really heartened to see people like Ro Khanna. I think that Maxwell Frost has been doing a really good job messaging on Alligator Alcatraz. Obviously, at the state level, people like Chev are knocking it out of the park. And I do come back over and over again. But see, I just did it. I was about to say Republicans often beat us at messaging, and I just used their Alligator Alcatraz framing, which we already talked about on here, is bullshit. It's the Everglades concentration camp. And so I think that we on the left are starting to or building out really effective messaging in ways that I think we've been slow to build out during the Trump years, because it does feel a little bit icky to try to match their messaging. But unfortunately, it works. There's a reason why all of the YouTube titles, not just on Legal AF and Midas Touch, are these kind of caps and exclamation point. When you find something that works, you do it. And so I'm happy to see that we're finding some stuff that works. What about you? Before we dive into, as discussed, I know you and I were reading through a lot of different kind of ICE data stuff to prepare for this episode. And so a little, not optimistic or pessimistic, but just a little walloped over the head by the horrors before we jump into it. Let's start with some hope.
Well, I don't know if this is like hope, but I just watched K-pop Demon Hunters, which gave me so much life. It was, if you haven't seen it, this is not going to be any spoilers. It was a radical reminder to rest and also the importance of removing guilt and shame. I love animation, and the songs were just like fantastic. And I think it was just a really good, like feel good resource for anyone who's doing the work every day, going to protest, invested in mutual aid, about just the importance of rest. I also follow the NAP ministry. But this was just like a joyful movie on Netflix, no matter how, depending on how you feel about it. But I think it was just a really great resource and tool also for just personal self-reflection, and some questions that I continue to ask myself. How do we allow guilt and shame to prevent us from doing the work that we need to do every day? How do we negate our rest and aren't ready for the battles ahead? There is a lot on our plates. There is a lot cycling through the news cycle. They've already said what their goal is. It's to flood the zone and to make us feel as if we do not have the tools, community, or power in order to fight back. So every day that we can remind ourselves that we're in it for the long haul and we're not here for a short fight. This is going to be a long, potentially generational and multi-generational fight. And so tools like K-pop Demon Hunter, one, make me feel really good and tap into a part of my brain that I don't always get to. And I think it's a really good, easy, and lazy act of resistance. So if anyone is feeling that they haven't stepped out onto the streets recently, or they haven't donated to that organization, pop on K-pop Demon Hunter and see what you can learn and reflect on.
I have not seen that, so I will take your word for it. I'm not the bit that what that triggered. I'm sure it's great. Everyone let us know your favorite. I've heard the songs are excellent, but
Top tier.
Triggered and then connects, I think, back to the idea of when you were introing, we need to really be paying attention to what's happening with ICE, to what's happening with surveillance. And I totally agree. And then I was thinking about the fact that you and I have been sending a lot of these articles back and forth, and I did not read them until today to prepare for this episode taping. And so when we're talking about continuing to pay attention and stay dialed in, I think your reference to flooding the zone is really well taken. And I also, this is my K-pop hunters flip back always, is this passage from Let This Radicalize You. If you are not super familiar with organizing and abolitionist work, Miriam Kaba has had probably more than anyone else, other than, people I know in real life, impacted had the same degree of impact on how I think about change and theory. And so this book is co-written with Kelly Hayes. They're both spent a lot of time in Chicago. I think Kelly is still based here. But there's a really, I think, powerful section about how we are not just having the zone flooded under the Trump administration, which I also think we can apply to our conversation about ICE, but there's a whole section about how the gutting of public education was geared toward the prevention of an educated proletariat, as a Reagan advisor once put it, while denouncing free college, and has robbed many young people of the opportunity to explore a great deal of history and literature and to develop a personal practice around that exploration. Consequently, most people do not read as much as they would like to. Of course, reading's not the only way to learn, but capitalism also makes it difficult for people to access information in other ways. How many times have you planned to check out a museum exhibit, lecture, podcast, art installation, or any other opportunity to learn and expand your analysis, and found you simply do not have the time or energy? And I think it's a really powerful reframe. I love this book. It's Let This Radicalize You. And if you follow me on TikTok, you've definitely heard me read that exact passage before. But I think that it's a powerful reminder of gentleness with ourselves while continuing to hold ourselves accountable, which leads us, I think, into talking about this series of articles that we reviewed to kind of talk about the expansion of ICE surveillance in the United States today. And specifically, I want to focus and start our conversation on the sharing of Medicaid data, like personal health information with ICE that's just been announced, as well as the sharing of IRS data. ProPublica did a really excellent write-up about not just how this is happening, but also, I think sometimes because we live in the current hellscape that I hope is radicalizing all of us, I think that we lose sight of what is normal a little bit. And ProPublica pointed out that typically, like, taxpayer data is one of the most private kind of things that the government has access to. It's your social security number, it's your employer. We, as Miriam Kaba said, we prioritize capitalism in this way. And so there's a real kind of almost sacredness in our culture related to paying your taxes and to that data. And historically, you had to ask very, very tailored questions. You had to have all of this information to get any taxpayer data to confirm anything. And ICE is going to have access to everyone's taxpayer data from 9 to 5 for at least the next 6 weeks, where they can just pull whatever they want for quote unquote immigration enforcement, which, number one, I think it's very important to remind people at all times, civil offense. You go to civil court if you are in immigration proceedings. It's not a criminal charge to have entered without documentation, to have overstayed a visa. And also, I think people may or may not be aware that the vast majority of undocumented people, or people without legal status, that can mean, different things, but people who are currently in immigration court have to pay their taxes. They pay taxes whether they have work authorization, whether they're working under the table, because they check those records before they let you get status. And so you have to be paying taxes. And there's an oft-cited kind of gross stat that people without documentation pay far more into the US economy than they receive from it. And so we're disincentivizing good behavior over and over and over again, with arrests at courts, with turning over IRS data for immigration enforcement. We're making it impossible for people to do things the quote unquote right way, even if you believe that is something that is accessible to many people, which it really isn't.
Yeah. And just to pull that thread just a little bit more, and I say pull the thread a lot more because, as you can tell, I have tons of yarn behind my back, so I'm a crazy crocheter, and I only make references to yarn and fiber crafts. But I think one important thing that you said right there, Rachel, was that undocumented immigrants pay so much into our system, to the tune of $96.7 billion in 2022. This is not a small amount of money. And that's at the local, state, and federal level. I think one of the things that was also highlighted both in a couple of the readings that I read, in addition to the ProPublica article, which were super important, was that once we create a system where undocumented immigrants are no longer opting into the IRS system because they do not feel comfortable, and they can then be tagged and flagged by ICE, even if they don't have a criminal record, it now sets the precedent that they are going to go underground. They're going to take their dollars underground. And as someone who looks at state budgets probably a lot more than the average person, being in the state legislature, the impact of this administration on state budgets has already been pretty impactful. Key programs like SNAP, HUD grants have been cut, and other key programs, especially for states that have programs that cover undocumented immigrants' healthcare, or that protect LGBT plus people, or physicians and the right to access abortion, have had their dollars threatened at the federal level. Lots of these programs are supplemented by federal dollars, and if the federal government and this administration continue to use those dollars as a way to control states, they will either lose on that money or they'll give up critical populations. Part of the reason why immigrants being afraid to use formal channels like reporting their earnings to the IRS is going to impact the states. If that is $96.7 billion going to both local, state, and federal economies, and they are no longer reporting that information, local budgets, which are already pretty tight margins, and by local, I mean cities and municipalities that often operate on razor thin margins, like $1 million here could make or break a city and or cause them to raise property taxes or other types of taxes. A state budget that is losing millions of dollars in revenue will potentially have to cut critical programs that address food security, housing, schools, etc. So the consequences of this, if you are not compelled by the moral obligation to treat all of our neighbors, including those without a legal status, as real people, is a financial one. Your taxes, do things for your day-to-day life. Oftentimes, and I was talking about this with a friend in the United States, we flush a toilet and forget where the water comes from. We turn on a light and forget where the water comes from. That departments of public works make our water systems work, that our electricity can be on publicly owned grids. Our schools are publicly funded. Our roads are typically publicly funded. And so when you are going to impact a community that is now afraid to report their tax dollars, that is going to come back to the consumer. And I think that's one thing, whether it's tariffs or losing Medicaid access or impacting our rural hospitals through some of the most recent Trump administration actions, there is not only a moral obligation to protect these communities and hold them vulnerable, but there's also a real human impact and a financial impact that I think people are missing. And I hate to go to but the finances. Some people only listen to that language. And as a formerly low income Black queer person, the communities that are going to be most impacted are Black and brown communities that can't afford to have their taxes raised, Black and brown communities that can't afford cuts to critical programs like education, like transportation, and like healthcare. So the downstream effects of actions like this are going to be huge. They might not be felt for a while, but I believe if we lose even a little bit of that revenue, lots of cities and states across the nation will feel that impact.
And I think too, we're not going to lose just a little bit of it. And I think you're alluding to this, and similarly to you, I feel a lot of ickiness when I talk about the financial impacts of these things, because not just there's a real duty, I think, to make sure that we are centering humanity in everything that we do, but also because I am a white woman who grew up mostly in Ohio. There were many years of my life when I argued these things, I felt so removed from them that I was arguing the financial impacts. And I think that because of that, and knowing how often at Ohio State, for example, I was just arguing about the revenue that undocumented migrants bring into our system as opposed to the humanity of every single individual person, that I almost overcorrect. And I think that we really need to be able to talk about all of those things and not assume good intent such that when people are centering only one thing that it, you're off the hook and it's not harmful, but allow people to talk about the full stream effects of all of these things and wait to make sure that they get there, or point out whether or not they're getting there. And because I think not even just from a, this is how we persuade people perspective, but from a genuine, exactly what you said, the impacts on people that live in these cities, both the undocumented people who are now afraid to pay taxes and everybody else, those are also human costs. And I think that one of the things that, to continue on just kind of faults of my own as a white person talking about these things historically, and I'm sure going forward, so make sure everyone always tells me those things. I think that it's been a long time since I have had anything but shut the fuck up to say to someone who says, well, they need to come here the right way, because I have been doing immigration work now for almost 5 years as a portion of my practice. And I know that the people that say things like that have no idea what our immigration system looks like. Even people who have experienced it, I think that sometimes we see people who came here 20, 30 years ago talking about, well, I did things the right way. Why can't these people do things the right way? And 20, 30 years ago, ICE didn't exist. Mm-hmm. So you're more than welcome to talk about your experience, but you need to come to it with a degree of humility and acknowledging the really unbelievably punitive changes that have been made to our system over the last several decades. And so I think that one of the things that I want to take responsibility for too is that years ago, when people who were, in legal process or legal proceedings or similar would be nervous about paying taxes to the IRS, right? The messaging that people were getting was, this data is never going to be used against you because there are all of these protections for it. And I understand why it feels a little bit scary to be giving the government your address, to be giving the government your address to pay your taxes, to go to immigration court so that they can send you notices, all of these things. But the US government is just imagine the pushback if the Trump administration were to start going through everybody's IRS files. And if you ever had that kind of reaction to people being scared, I think there's two big takeaways from that. The first is that you better be in the streets or providing financial support for people to get effective representation, or assisting very actively in whatever way that you know how and that is accessible to you. And the second is
that as someone, like if you are a white person in this country, it is so deeply ingrained in you that the systems are trustworthy, that it becomes very, I think that people often are dismissive of legitimate fear when expressed by people who have direct experience with the immigration system, with Black people when they're talking about policing, or anyone who's visibly non-white in that way, with Indigenous people. Even if it's not like actively dismissive, I think there can really be some kind of calm down sentiment. And if you are someone who, like me, had those feelings, instead of pushing them to the side because you don't want to deal with the fact that you were wrong and that you were like a poor ally, that's something that needs to be corrected as you identify it. Because otherwise, you're not going to feel less guilty about poor allyship 5 years hence. Like, it's not going to be easier to grapple with in a year or 2 years or 5 years. And so you are instead going to have more to feel disappointed in yourself for. So it's quite brave, I think, to redirect those things. And I think it's a powerful reminder that we need to believe people when they are suspicious of the overarching system, and that Black and brown people have been speaking about that for a long time. And that's also something to really think about if you're someone who feels very like progressive except for Palestine, right? That's something to connect as well to our unwillingness to trust on the ground journalism by Middle Easterners and Palestinians, and then to wait until like the BBC or the New York Times confirms it 6 months later when tens of thousands more people are dead, and say, oh, I guess the Palestinians were right all along. You know, I guess the migrants were right all along. The Black people were right all along. Like, you give yourself some grace because you're socialized in a certain way, but you don't get to give yourself grace like every single time. Mm-hmm. At a certain point, that is a you problem.
Yeah. And I think what's so important there, Rachel, and I said it when we were on with Chev last week, that so many people have been ringing alarm bells and our litmus test has already been activated, and so many people failed the first litmus test. The policing system in our country, whether we're talking about ICE, the new policing system, the new Jim Crow, if you will, I don't know if that's copyrighted, but new Jim Crow, with the increase in funding, the unprecedented increase in funding to ICE as one of the now largest and most funded agencies, to just like throw out some numbers. I'll get to those numbers in a second, but paying a warden $125 an hour and up to $400,000 in overtime, and the starting salary being 3 to 4 times more than a starting police officer salary in Florida should also show us that their priority is not on protecting people. It's on giving out massive contracts to their politically connected allies in a series of opaque contracting processes that negate the state law. This is going to be following up on the Florida decision to now pay with taxpayer dollars $245 million to get the Everglades concentration camp off the ground. Those are all right now state funds. There's been conversations about the federal government reimbursing them through FEMA, I believe, but that right now, the Ron DeSantis government in Florida has agreed to pay and is paying $250 million to get the Everglades concentration set up. And that is all taxpayer dollars. So if you are a Floridian and you hear that your tax dollars are being used to create and fund a concentration camp and pay ICE officials more money than the average person in Florida makes in order to detain people who are not even there on criminal charges, what does this say about our system of policing and our system of detaining people? For too long, Black and brown Americans have been saying that our prison system is disappearing our uncles, our brothers, our community members, our neighbors for way too long. And we're seeing that same system now on steroids advancing that process. And when I think about how do we get people to move to action, some of that just understanding how this process works. It is intentionally opaque. There are intentionally things that we do not typically have access to or know how they work, because evil in power operate oftentimes in darkness or without accountability or any authority over them. And I think this is why it's so important to pay attention both at the local, state, and federal level. Right now, our federal level is getting so much attention, which is important because there is some crazy shit going on there. But a lot of these decisions are also happening at the local level. The fact that Florida tax dollars are being used to fund this, and this is being proposed around the country. There are more sites for detention facilities, and more states just this week announced that they'd be using potentially their military bases and their military forces and Coast Guards in order to participate in facilitating the Operation at Large, as Stephen Miller calls it, which is to plan to detain 3,000 people per day for the rest of, I don't know when they plan to stop, but they're also using resources that they could be using to actually investigate some of the real serious crimes happening. They're taking away FBI agents. They're taking away other local agents in order to focus purely on ICE detention. They've siphoned resources away from other critical agencies, including investigating things like, I don't know, the collusion of private equity and algorithms to price many people out of their homes. Like, all of these things are connected. And when we fail to realize how the surveillance state that they are creating through ICE immigration is connected to how you live, how you eat, and potentially is a future that we can see where more and more people are going to face detainment. And I know we didn't get to touch so much on the DHS aspect of it, but we should probably do another episode and follow up on how crazy it is that teenagers, and some people as young as 4, will potentially have their DNA obtained by DHS because they were detained by ICE indefinitely in some facility, in some database called CODIS, due to the FBI. This is a really stark alarm. Like, I got mad at my mom for having her information in like 23andMe. I was like, you never know where this can go. And a few weeks ago, months ago, it's hard to keep up with the timelines. Lots of people who did 23andMe or Ancestry.com were warned to remove their data and request it be deleted because that company was going to be sold and they could no longer uphold those agreements. If people are concerned about private companies potentially using their DNA, imagine the federal government now having your information on a database indefinitely. From 4 years old, which is the youngest person reported to have their data, over 2 million people who have been detained by ICE now have their information available at the local, state, federal, and international level. Their biological information held for years. This is a huge warning for anyone about the state of policing and where policing can go, because if they're going to do it to people who they have told you and taught you to villainize in our communities, our undocumented neighbors and friends and community members, imagine the leap and the slippery slope to get it to do to your actual neighbors, people who are born in the US, people who are Black and brown, people who are queer, people who are trans, people who are disabled. This is the playbook of authoritarianism. They will find a villain, and once that villain is out, they will replace that villain with a new person, because this is not just an attack on our democracy. This is a power grab for a small group of people who want our country to roll back. I know we're over time, Rachel, and we can gab forever, so I'm glad we're doing an episode just together. But how do you want to wrap up? I know I talked about K-pop Demon Slayer. We talked about some pretty heavy topics today as well. But there is always hope as long as we're willing to put that hope into action. And as pragmatic optimists, I never want to leave our praggies on a sour note.
Unfortunately, I do have a couple more sour things that I wanted to get to. Just because, first of all, you referenced kind of the ICE budget, and I do just want to make sure that we're shouting this every single time possible and get the actual comparative stats out there, which is that the ICE budget is now larger than all but 15 of the world's militaries. 15 of the world's militaries. And one of them is ours, obviously. So I constantly want to have that be front and center, because this is not normal. This is a private army that the Trump administration is building out, and they're doing it because ICE reports they are an executive agency. They do not have the same kind of restrictions placed upon them that
military, actual enlisted military does. And the president can deploy them without congressional approval in a way that they are not supposed to do for the military, though we are, of course, seeing over and over again that the Trump administration is testing even those limits. And I think that that connects back as well to the private equity things that you've pointed out. That is a standalone episode. And I think last, but certainly not least, I want to connect as well to the point that Chev made on our show, where he was talking about DeSantis using these emergency kind of immigration emergency powers to construct these things without Florida legislature approval. And again, how we are seeing that as a kind of initial version of what we're already seeing and will continue to see nationwide at the federal level. And so all of these things, I just really want to hammer it home. All of these things are repeats of what we saw happen to Muslim people at Guantanamo, to Black people in the US prison system for far longer. And when we can only acknowledge those things retroactively, and there are many people that I think still have a really big block about the prison system in the United States and do not believe that prisons and policing are fundamentally flawed and that instead it's a few bad apples, that I think that we're talking about two different things here, right? Which is that there are so many people, low income people, people from affected communities who go into policing and into jobs in prisons because they do want to help and they do want to make a difference. And their individual motivations are very much not the individual bad apple of it all, right? But we're talking about structures and what we as a society have come to accept as treatment of our neighbors just being grabbed off the streets, because that is what policing is to a large group of people in the United States, the same way that that is what ICE has been and is very much ramping up to become even more to immigrants and to Latino people who are US citizens, who are not immigrants in the United States. And so it is okay if you have not independently made those connections years ago, the first time there was, reporting on abolition or whatever, but it is not okay to continue to get up every day and bury your head in the sand. And I think that the necessity of having being able to make forward-looking connections based on history, both recent and more long-term, is a skill that I see many people building continuously and that I really appreciate. And that's what keeps me hopeful, is that I think that there are so many people who are doing the work day to day. And I think that there's real opportunities for messaging to break through. Mm-hmm. And I think that we see that over and over again. And the thing that I always want to leave people with is if they're very, very defensive of systems, despite all of the overwhelming of it, people talking about their own lived experiences and the harm, the statistics of what we see about really racialized enforcement of low-level laws, of prosecutorial discretion, of all of these things. If you were presenting a Trump voter with that amount of anecdotal and statistical data showing the horrors of Donald Trump, the evils of Donald Trump, you'd say they were pretty stupid if they didn't change their minds, right? I hear the same people say, these Trump voters, I can't believe they believe these things. And then really wake up in the morning and say that fundamentally there's no issues with our policing and prison systems. And really it's just a couple of bad apples. Let's just hold everybody to the same standard on this one. And I think that that's possible. And I think that we're getting there. And that keeps me hopeful, that I think that at the end of the day, I've seen so many people change their minds and recognize the failings of our systems and of messaging done deliberately by the people that control the algorithms, by the people that control the media, by which I mean, 4 billionaires at this point. I think that people are really not get, we like to think that everyone's getting the same information that we are. And so it's like a personal moral failing when they're not making the same connections as us. We know that's not true. We know that there's this huge algorithmic capture. We know that there's this whole propaganda arm of Fox News that is blaring out to people over and over again. And so when I see people actually connecting with their neighbors and I see people having these difficult conversations, that keeps me really hopeful.
Yes. Well, thank you, Rachel. I appreciate that. And as our Praggies can see, we love to gab, and we will go and gab away. I'm thankful for all this time. And one thing that keeps me focused on building that better world that we all, I hope, know and believe is possible is that we are not single issue people. We do not live single issue lives. Those are the words of Audre Lorde. We can focus on thinking about ICE and our prison industrial complex and the connections to the Palestinian struggle in Gaza currently, because none of these issues are disconnected from each other. If you do not believe that what's happening in the United States is not connected to the global power grab and so many other issues, forced migration, war and conflict, then I really urge you all to read a little bit more, whether it's sci-fi and fantasy, and about how you can use books as tool to see the struggle for whether you want to call it good or evil, right and wrong, justice and injustice. There are so many teaching tools and so many people who have been documenting ways that you can decolonize your mind and ways that you can open up to maybe seeing connections that you may not have seen. Maybe you are just now opening yourself up to these ideas, and there is never a bad time to start interrogating what you have held and believed to be true to what you are coming to believe as a struggle that you, yes, you listeners, Praggies, are implicitly involved in. And whether you decide to sit this one out or you decide to only focus on one issue, everything is connected. And that connection is what makes us stronger, but is also what makes all of our movements that more important for all of us to engage in. So thank you all for joining again. Please like, subscribe, and share on the Legal AF podcast, part of the Midas Touch Network. We are Pragmatic Optimists, Tiara and Rachel, and we will see you again next week.
Thanks so much, y'all. Bye.
Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.